Sometimes the last light left in the world is the one behind a stranger's window. The first puppy stopped moving just as Ethan Brooks reached the old gravel road that disappeared beneath fresh snow. For one terrible second, the tiny body in the cardboard box felt impossibly still against the wool blanket wrapped around it, and the former Navy SEAL tightened his grip as if warmth could be shared through determination alone. The winter wind swept across the Wyoming Valley with a lonely whistle, carrying dry snow that stung his weathered face and settled across his shoulders like cold ash. His boots sank several inches into the drift with every exhausted step. Bella, the sable German shepherd mother walking beside him, never looked at him. She kept her amber eyes fixed on the small box, nudging it gently every few moments with her nose as though reminding her puppies that she was still there. Her coat was soaked from melting snow, her ribs faintly visible beneath layers of damp fur, yet she never slowed. Ethan had seen courage in places where maps ended, but nothing compared to the quiet determination of a mother who refused to surrender while her children still breathed. Nearly 2 miles earlier, he had found Bella curled around the litter beneath the collapsed remains of an abandoned toolshed. She had chosen the only shelter she could find after an unexpected blizzard swept through the valley, shielding the puppies from the wind with her own body until she could barely stand. Ethan had been driving back from a volunteer veterans event when he spotted movement through the blowing snow. He almost kept driving. Visibility was less than 50 feet, and every weather report warned people to stay off the roads. Yet something in Bella's eyes had stopped him. There had been no barking, no growling, only a silent plea older than language itself. Now he carried her family toward the only farmhouse whose porch light still burned across the white landscape. It glowed like a single candle against an ocean of darkness. The distance looked short, but every step demanded more strength than the last. The puppy nearest the edge of the box let out a tiny whimper, so faint Ethan almost imagined it. He smiled despite the ache spreading through his shoulders. "Hang in there, little one," he whispered. "Just a little farther." Bella lifted her head the instant she heard his voice, then gently licked the smallest puppy before continuing forward. The farmhouse slowly grew larger through the curtain of snow. Warm yellow light spilled from 2 kitchen windows, casting soft reflections across the icy yard. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak that reminded Ethan of Christmas mornings from a lifetime ago, before deployments, before funerals, before silence became easier than conversation. The smell almost hurt. It reminded him what warmth felt like. The wooden fence surrounding the property creaked softly in the wind, and an old porch swing rocked back and forth without anyone sitting in it. Everything about the place suggested safety. Home. Hope. Bella suddenly stopped walking. Ethan turned. She wasn't looking at the house anymore. She was staring at the motionless puppy tucked against the blanket, gently touching its tiny head with her nose again and again. There was no panic in her movements, only patience. Faith. As though she believed that as long as she stayed beside her babies, none of them were truly alone. Ethan swallowed hard. He had spent years believing survival belonged to the strongest. Bella was quietly teaching him it sometimes belonged to the ones who refused to leave each other behind. He climbed the 3 frozen porch steps, every board groaning beneath his boots. Snow slid from his jacket as he carefully shifted the box against one arm. Bella sat beside the front door without making a sound, her tail wrapped protectively around her paws while icy flakes collected across her back. Ethan reached for the weathered brass knocker. His hand hesitated only a moment before striking it against the wood. The sound echoed through the quiet farmhouse. Once, twice, then silence returned. Inside, footsteps crossed an old hardwood floor. A lock clicked. The door slowly opened, releasing a wave of blessed warmth into the frozen night. Ethan felt it brush against his face before he even saw the woman standing in the doorway. Her silver hair framed a tired face lined by years neither kind nor easy. She looked first at Ethan, then at the soaked German shepherd, then finally at the tiny puppies nestled inside the box. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said quietly, holding the box a little closer. "Please, just let the puppies warm up." The woman did not answer right away. Her eyes lingered on the small cardboard box, then settled on Bella, who remained perfectly still despite the bitter wind gathering fresh snow across her back. For a long moment, The only sound came from the old porch swing creaking gently and the steady crackle of the fire somewhere deep inside the house. Ethan could feel the warmth drifting through the open doorway, brushing against his frozen hands before disappearing into the storm behind him. One of the tiny puppies gave a weak little cry, barely louder than a whisper, and Bella lowered her head, touching the puppy with the tip of her nose as if reminding it that its mother had not gone anywhere. The woman's expression hardened, though not with anger. It looked more like someone closing an old door inside her heart. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I cannot do this." Before Ethan could answer, she slowly pulled the door toward her. The warm light narrowed until only a thin ribbon remained between them. Then the latch clicked into place. Ethan stood motionless on the porch. He had faced impossible situations before, but somehow that soft refusal carried a different kind of weight. He looked down at the puppies. They depended entirely on him now. He drew a slow breath, tucked the blanket more carefully around the tiny bodies, and stepped back into the swirling snow without saying a single word. Bella rose immediately and followed him without hesitation. Together they crossed the yard, searching for any place that might block the wind. Near an old maple tree stood a weathered woodshed whose roof still held against the storm. Ethan carried the box inside and found several dry pieces of firewood stacked neatly against one wall. He would never take what was not his, but he gathered loose branches that had already fallen outside and carefully built a tiny fire ring several feet from the shed entrance where the smoke could escape. It took 3 careful attempts before a small orange flame finally appeared. The little fire barely pushed back the cold, yet it was enough to soften the air around the puppies by a few precious degrees. Ethan slipped off his heavy gloves and cupped his hands around the smallest puppy, gently sharing what warmth remained in his fingers. Bella lay beside the box, curling her body around the litter once again. Her tired amber eyes never left them. Every few seconds she checked each puppy, gently nudging one, then another, counting them in the only way a mother knew. Ethan smiled faintly despite the cold tightening every muscle in his body. "You are stronger than most people I have ever met," he whispered to Bella. She blinked once and rested her chin beside the box. Across the yard, hidden behind frosted kitchen curtains, the woman quietly watched everything. She had expected the stranger to leave. Instead, he stayed. He never complained. He never shouted. He never demanded kindness. He simply worked to keep a family alive with whatever little he had. She noticed him remove his own scarf and fold it beneath the puppies to lift them away from the frozen ground. She noticed him rubbing their tiny paws one at a time with extraordinary patience. Most of all, she noticed that Bella refused to move closer to the fire unless every puppy had been settled first. Something stirred deep inside her, something she had tried for years not to remember. A memory of another snowy night, another uniform, another loyal dog whose eyes carried that same quiet devotion. She turned away from the window, but the image followed her into the silent kitchen. If this story touches your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss more uplifting stories about courage, compassion, and the remarkable bond between people and their faithful companions. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the valley, but inside the little woodshed, a tiny flame kept burning, fragile against the darkness, refusing to surrender. The little fire crackled softly, sending thin ribbons of warmth into the freezing air, but Ethan knew it would never be enough if the temperature continued to fall through the night. He checked each puppy again with careful hands, feeling the faint rise and fall of tiny chests beneath the blanket. The smallest one, the same puppy that had frightened him on the road, remained unusually quiet, though a slow, gentle breath still escaped its tiny nose. Ethan released a silent sigh of relief. Bella watched every movement without taking her eyes off her family for more than a heartbeat. Whenever Ethan reached toward one of the puppies, she leaned forward just enough to see what he was doing, then relaxed again when she realized he meant only to help. Trust like that was never given freely. It was earned one patient moment at a time. Snow continued drifting across the entrance of the woodshed, softening every sound until the entire valley seemed wrapped inside a quiet blanket. Somewhere in the distance, an old windmill turned with a slow metallic groan. The smell of burning oak from the farmhouse chimney mixed with the scent of pine and fresh snow, creating a strange sense of peace despite the bitter cold. Ethan sat on an overturned bucket beside the little fire, rubbing his stiff hands together before holding them near the flames. His knees ached from the long walk, and fatigue settled heavily across his shoulders. Yet every time he considered resting, one of the puppies would make a tiny sound and immediately pull his attention back. He smiled faintly. During his years of military service, he had learned that responsibility rarely arrived when life was convenient. It arrived when someone else needed you the most. Bella slowly lifted herself and walked toward the entrance of the shed. Instead of searching for food or water, she stood quietly, staring toward the farmhouse. Her ears twitched once. Then she looked back at Ethan before returning to the puppies. She repeated the same movement several times, never barking, never whining. It was almost as though she wanted him to notice something rather than follow her. Ethan studied the behavior carefully. Dogs communicated in countless silent ways, and Bella seemed too intelligent for random actions. He stepped outside, brushing fresh snow from his jacket. The farmhouse stood peacefully beneath the winter sky, warm lights still glowing behind frosted windows. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Bella continued watching the house with unwavering focus. Ethan followed her gaze until he noticed an old wooden structure standing behind the main barn. It was barely visible beneath decades of weathered boards and drifting snow. The faded outline suggested it had once been a kennel. The discovery stirred his curiosity. Why would Bella keep looking toward an abandoned kennel instead of the warm house itself? Before he could think further, the farmhouse curtain moved ever so slightly. Someone inside was watching again. Ethan did not wave. He did not call for help another time. Instead, he simply returned to the puppies and gently adjusted the blanket around them. His actions carried no expectation of reward. If kindness came, he would welcome it. If it did not, he would continue doing everything within his power. Inside the farmhouse, the elderly woman remained motionless beside the kitchen window, one hand wrapped around a steaming mug that had long since gone cold. She could clearly see the stranger kneeling beside the German Shepherd family. She noticed how carefully he lifted each tiny paw toward the warmth of the fire before placing the puppy back beside its mother. She noticed him remove his own heavy coat and drape it across the opening of the shed to block the wind without completely trapping the smoke. Most of all, she noticed that neither the man nor the dog ever showed frustration. There was only quiet perseverance. A memory she had buried for many years slowly resurfaced, bringing with it the image of another winter evening, another uniform, and another faithful dog that had refused to leave someone behind. Her breathing slowed as old emotions she believed had disappeared forever gently returned. Outside, Bella lowered herself beside the puppies once more, resting her head lightly against the edge of the box. Ethan looked toward the dark horizon where the snowfall seemed to blend into the night itself. He did not know whether anyone would open that door again, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. As long as there was even the smallest chance of seeing morning together, neither he nor Bella would abandon those tiny lives to the cold. The fire had burned down to glowing embers by the time the snowfall began to ease, leaving the valley wrapped in a deep, almost sacred silence. Ethan added another small branch to the flames, careful not to waste the little dry wood he had managed to gather. The warmth remained modest, but inside the shelter it was enough to keep the air from becoming unbearable. One by one he checked the puppies again. Their tiny bodies were no longer trembling quite as violently, and the smallest one gave a faint stretch before nestling closer against Bella's chest. Ethan smiled with quiet relief. "That is better," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Bella responded by softly licking the puppy's head before looking back toward the farmhouse once again. It was the same look she had repeated all evening, patient and unwavering, as though she believed the answer to something important still waited there. Ethan followed her gaze once more. The old kennel behind the barn caught his attention again. Covered in snow and leaning slightly with age, it seemed forgotten by everyone except Bella. Curiosity finally overcame hesitation. "Stay here," he said gently. Bella watched him for a moment, then settled back beside her puppies without protest. Ethan crossed the yard through ankle-deep snow, his flashlight casting a pale beam across weathered fence posts and frozen footprints left by deer earlier that day. The kennel stood behind a row of tall pine trees, protected from the wind. Its wooden gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, and years of winter storms had stripped much of the paint away. Yet something about it felt cared for rather than abandoned. The latch still worked smoothly. The roof had recently been repaired. Someone had quietly maintained the little building, even if no animals lived there anymore. Ethan pushed the gate open. Inside, he found clean straw spread neatly across the floor and several empty stainless steel bowls stacked carefully against one wall. A faded blue blanket rested inside the largest sleeping area, folded with surprising precision. Dust covered very little. Someone had visited this place not long ago. His flashlight paused on a framed photograph hanging crookedly from a wooden beam. He stepped closer. The picture showed a much younger version of the elderly woman standing beside a smiling man in a military uniform. Between them sat a magnificent German shepherd wearing a service vest. The dog looked remarkably similar to Bella, though older and broader across the shoulders. Ethan studied the photograph in silence. On the bottom edge of the frame, someone had handwritten a single sentence. Faithful until the very end. The words lingered in his thoughts as he gently returned the photograph to its place. Suddenly Bella appeared beside the kennel entrance. She had quietly followed him after all. Instead of exploring the building, she walked directly to the old blanket and lowered her nose against it. Her tail moved once, slowly. Then she looked back at Ethan with calm amber eyes. She was not searching for food. She was remembering. Ethan knelt beside her, gently running his hand across the faded fabric. It still carried the faint scent of cedar and old soap beneath the smell of time. Bella rested her head against his arm for only a second before returning to the doorway, as though satisfied he had discovered what she wanted him to see. Across the yard, hidden behind the kitchen window, the elderly woman watched the quiet scene unfold. Her eyes widened as Bella entered the old kennel without fear. No stranger could have known that place existed. No stray dog should have walked there so naturally. A memory she had locked away for years suddenly became impossible to ignore. She remembered another German shepherd who used to sleep on that same blue blanket after long days beside her late husband. She remembered the loyalty that had filled this property with laughter instead of silence. She remembered promising herself that she would never allow another dog to remind her of everything she had lost. Yet tonight, watching Bella gently lower her head upon that forgotten blanket before returning to her own puppies waiting in the shed, the promise no longer felt like protection. It felt like loneliness. Ethan quietly closed the kennel gate and followed Bella back through the fresh snow. Neither of them spoke, yet both carried the feeling that the old building had revealed only the first piece of a much larger story waiting beneath the winter night. The wind finally settled into a low whisper that drifted through the pine trees instead of roaring across the valley, and for the first time since sunset the silence felt less like loneliness and more like expectation. Ethan returned to the woodshed carrying another armful of fallen branches he had gathered from beneath the shelter of the evergreens. He carefully fed 2 small pieces into the fire, watching the flames brighten just enough to cast a gentle amber glow across Bella and her puppies. The warmth spread slowly through the little space. One puppy stretched both front paws before nestling closer against its mother's chest, and another let out a tiny sleepy sigh that made Ethan smile despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body. Bella lifted her head and looked directly at him. There was gratitude in her steady amber eyes, but there was something else as well, a quiet confidence that seemed to say she believed morning would come. Ethan reached into his backpack and found the last bottle of water he had been saving for the drive home. He poured a little into a shallow metal cup and placed it beside Bella. She drank only a few careful laps before stepping away and nudging the cup toward the puppies as if reminding herself that everything she did still revolved around them. Ethan had witnessed extraordinary acts of discipline during his years of military service, yet nothing had prepared him for the simple devotion of a mother who measured every choice against the well-being of her family. Across the snowy yard, a lamp flickered on in an upstairs window of the farmhouse. The elderly woman had not gone to bed. She sat in an old wooden chair wrapped in a quilt, unable to pull her thoughts away from the forgotten kennel and the photograph Ethan had quietly discovered. Memories drifted through her mind with the same gentle persistence as the falling snow. She remembered her late husband, Daniel, laughing as a young German shepherd chased snowflakes across the yard. She remembered how that faithful dog had waited beside the front porch every evening until Daniel returned home. When illness eventually took both of them within a single year, the house had grown unbearably quiet. She convinced herself that closing her heart would hurt less than opening it again. Tonight, that certainty no longer felt as strong. She rose from her chair and walked into the kitchen. A pot of homemade chicken soup still rested on the stove, its comforting aroma filling the room with memories of family dinners long past. Beside it sat a loaf of fresh bread she had baked that morning, never expecting to share it with anyone. She stood motionless, her hand resting lightly on the counter, wrestling with a decision that seemed much larger than simply opening a door. Outside, Ethan noticed the smallest puppy trying to lift its tiny head. The little creature managed only a few inches before gently collapsing against Bella's foreleg. Bella immediately lowered her muzzle and softly brushed the puppy's face, encouraging it without a single sound. Ethan wrapped the blanket a little tighter around the family and whispered, "You are all doing better than you were an hour ago. Keep fighting. Dawn is getting closer." His words disappeared into the quiet night, yet somehow they made him believe them too. A sudden glow spilled across the snow. Ethan turned toward the farmhouse. The porch light had become brighter, and the front door slowly opened once again. The elderly woman stepped outside carrying a large woven basket covered by a thick towel. She paused at the top step, looking first at Ethan, then at Bella, whose ears immediately perked up though she remained beside her puppies. Without saying a word, the woman carefully walked through the snow toward the woodshed. She stopped a few feet away and gently lowered the basket onto a dry patch of ground. Inside were folded wool blankets, a clean towel, a kettle filled with hot water, and a small jar of honey. Her eyes lingered on Bella before settling on Ethan. "I was not ready to let anyone into my home," she said softly. "But that does not mean I have forgotten how to help." Ethan nodded with quiet gratitude. Neither of them spoke again for several moments. They simply stood together in the peaceful silence while the little fire crackled between them, and somewhere above the clouds the first faint promise of morning waited beyond the long winter night. The elderly woman stood quietly beside the little fire while snowflakes drifted lazily through the opening of the woodshed, dissolving into tiny drops of water the moment they touched the warmth. Bella lifted her head, studying the stranger with calm amber eyes that held neither fear nor suspicion. She simply watched, as if measuring the kindness carried in the woman's slow movements. The basket remained untouched for a moment until Ethan carefully unfolded one of the thick wool blankets and spread it beneath the cardboard box. The difference was immediate. Instead of resting against rough wooden boards chilled by hours of winter air, the puppies now lay upon soft warmth that gently insulated them from the cold. One tiny nose twitched. Another puppy stretched both front paws before settling back into peaceful sleep against Bella's side. The woman noticed every small change. A faint smile appeared on her face before disappearing almost as quickly as it came. "They are stronger than they look," she said softly. Ethan nodded, mostly because of her. He looked toward Bella with quiet admiration. She has not thought about herself once. The woman lowered herself onto an old wooden crate near the fire. She folded her gloved hands together and watched Bella gently lick each puppy one after another with remarkable patience. "There was another German shepherd here once," she said after a long silence. "His name was Duke." Ethan remained quiet, sensing she was not simply sharing a memory, but opening a door she had kept locked for years. "My husband trained him from the time he was only a few months old," she continued. "Every morning they walked these fields together. Every evening Duke waited on the porch until he saw Daniel coming home. It never mattered if the weather was sunny or if snow covered everything you could see. That dog believed home was wherever Daniel happened to be." She paused as the fire crackled softly between them. "When my husband passed away, Duke stayed beside the front door for weeks. Every afternoon he would sit there until sunset, watching the driveway, convinced Daniel would return." Her voice trembled gently before she smiled through the sadness. "I finally realized he was grieving too." Ethan looked toward the old kennel, standing quietly beyond the drifting snow. Suddenly everything made sense. The repaired roof, the folded blanket, the clean bowls. They had never been forgotten. They had simply become a place where memories were carefully preserved. After Duke was gone, the woman whispered, "I promised myself I would never love another dog. I thought it would protect me from losing someone again." Bella slowly rose and walked toward her. She did not beg for food or affection. She simply stopped within arm's reach and sat quietly, her tail resting on the straw while her puppies continued sleeping behind her. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Bella gently lowered her head. The woman hesitated before extending one trembling hand. Her fingers brushed the soft fur between Bella's ears. Bella closed her eyes for only a moment, leaning into the touch with complete trust before looking back toward her puppies. The woman quietly laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes. "You remind me of him," she whispered. "Not because you look the same, because you love the same way." Ethan felt something inside the little woodshed change. It was not dramatic. No sudden miracle filled the air. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of loneliness making room for hope. The woman reached into the basket once more and removed another folded blanket along with a thick quilt. "The shed is warmer now," she said, "but the house is warmer still." Ethan looked at her without speaking. She drew a slow breath and glanced toward the farmhouse glowing beneath the fading storm. "I am still not ready for strangers," she admitted honestly. "But perhaps I am ready to stop shutting kindness out." Bella turned toward the house as though she had understood every word. The first pale hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, painting the distant snow-covered hills with gentle shades of blue and silver. After the longest night any of them could remember, the valley no longer felt frozen in grief. It felt as though it had quietly begun, waiting for a new beginning. Morning arrived quietly over the valley, the first rays of sunlight spilling across the untouched snow until every fence post, pine branch, and rooftop shimmered with a gentle golden glow. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty. Ethan stepped outside the woodshed and drew a slow breath, the crisp mountain air carrying the clean scent of pine, cedar, and fresh snow. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe the hardest part of the night might truly be behind them. Behind him, Bella remained curled protectively around her puppies, though her posture had changed. The tension that had kept every muscle alert through the darkness had softened. One by one, the puppies stretched awake, tiny tails twitching clumsily as they searched for their mother. The smallest one, whose quiet breathing had worried Ethan throughout the night, managed to crawl across the blanket before letting out a surprisingly determined little bark that sounded far stronger than anything he had expected. Ethan smiled as Bella immediately lowered her head to nuzzle each puppy in turn, gently checking that every one of them was safe. The elderly woman appeared at the entrance carrying a steaming kettle and a simple breakfast packed inside another woven basket. Her face looked different in the morning light. The guarded expression Ethan had first encountered at the front door had given way to something gentler, something that had been hidden beneath years of solitude. She poured warm water into a clean bowl for Bella and quietly set another beside Ethan. "You must be hungry too," she said. Ethan accepted the cup with grateful hands. "Thank you." They stood together in comfortable silence while Bella drank slowly before returning once again to her puppies. The woman watched the German shepherd carefully and shook her head with quiet amazement. "She never forgets them," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "She reminds me that real strength is measured by who we protect, not by what we accomplish." The woman looked toward the old kennel beyond the barn. "Daniel used to say something similar," she said with a faint smile. "He believed that loyalty was not something you trained into a good dog. It was something you honored after it was freely given." Those words lingered in the cold morning air. Ethan glanced toward the framed photograph he had discovered the night before and finally asked, "Was your husband in the military?" She smiled softly. "He served in the Army National Guard before we settled here. Duke became his closest companion after he returned home. They healed together. When Daniel was struggling, Duke always seemed to know before anyone else did. Sometimes I think animals notice the quiet battles we try so hard to hide." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. He understood that truth better than he cared to admit. After leaving military service, there had been long months when the silence inside his own home had felt heavier than any backpack he had ever carried. Purpose had become difficult to recognize. Finding Bella and her puppies on that lonely road had not been part of his plans. Yet standing there now, surrounded by the peaceful stillness of the valley, he realized that helping them had quietly begun healing something inside himself as well. Bella suddenly stood and walked toward the elderly woman. This time there was no hesitation from either of them. The woman knelt carefully in the snow and gently scratched behind Bella's ears. Bella closed her eyes for a brief moment before leaning closer, then calmly returned to her puppies as though satisfied that another piece of trust had found its proper place. The woman laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar after so many years without company. "She has already decided I belong to her family," she said. Ethan chuckled. "I think she decided that before either of us realized it." Together they looked toward the 3 sleepy puppies, who were beginning to explore the edges of their blanket with uncertain little steps, tumbling over one another in harmless, clumsy determination. The sight filled the woodshed with quiet life. No miracle had arrived all at once. It had come through patient choices, gentle hands, shared warmth, and the willingness of 3 wounded hearts to trust again. As the morning sun climbed higher above the snow-covered hills, the farmhouse no longer looked like the end of a desperate journey. It looked like the beginning of a new chapter that none of them had expected to find. 3 days passed beneath clear winter skies, and with each sunrise the valley seemed a little less silent than before. Snow still covered the fields, but narrow ribbons of earth had begun to appear along the fence lines where the afternoon sun lingered the longest. The farmhouse, once wrapped in quiet isolation, now carried the gentle sounds of life again. Bella and her 3 puppies had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every morning the puppies stumbled across the old quilt with growing confidence, their oversized paws sliding across the wooden floor of the enclosed porch where the elderly woman had finally welcomed them after the coldest night had passed. Their tiny tails wagged at everything they discovered, from drifting dust caught in sunlight to the soft creak of the rocking chair by the window. Ethan remained for several days longer than he had originally planned. He repaired a loose fence, stacked fresh firewood beside the porch, and reinforced the roof of the old kennel that had quietly stood as a memorial for so many years. The work gave him purpose, and each completed task seemed to lift another invisible weight from his shoulders. The elderly woman, whose name Ethan had finally learned was Margaret, watched him through the kitchen window more than once with quiet appreciation. She had lived alone for so long that hearing footsteps around the property again felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. One crisp afternoon, she carried 2 steaming mugs onto the porch while Ethan sanded a weathered wooden sign that had once hung above the kennel entrance. The faded letters had almost disappeared beneath years of wind and snow. Margaret sat beside him without speaking for a while, listening to the distant call of chickadees and the gentle rustle of pine branches overhead. Finally, she broke the silence. "I forgot this place could sound alive," she said softly. Ethan looked across the snowy pasture where Bella patiently watched her adventurous puppies investigate every new scent. "Sometimes life waits quietly until someone is willing to notice it again," he replied. Margaret smiled, wrapping both hands around her warm mug. Daniel used to say almost the same thing. They shared an easy silence that required no explanation. Nearby, the smallest puppy wandered a little too far before losing confidence and letting out a tiny squeak. Bella immediately walked over, gently touching the puppy with her nose before guiding it back toward its brother and sister. Margaret laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "She teaches them without frightening them." Ethan nodded. "The best leaders usually do." Later that afternoon, they visited the old kennel together. Sunlight poured through the open doorway, illuminating the blue blanket that had remained there all those years. Margaret carefully lifted the framed photograph from the wall and wiped away a thin layer of dust. She handed it to Ethan. "I kept this hidden because I thought looking at it would only remind me of what I lost," she admitted. "Now I think it reminds me of everything I was lucky enough to have." Ethan studied the smiling faces in the picture before returning it to her. "Memories do not ask us to stop living," he said quietly. "They simply ask us not to forget." Margaret placed the photograph back on the wall, but this time she straightened it carefully instead of letting it lean. It was a small gesture, yet it carried the quiet certainty of someone choosing hope over sorrow. As the afternoon faded into evening, Bella led her puppies toward the kennel. Instead of entering alone, she paused at the doorway and looked back at Margaret. For a moment, the elderly woman simply stood there. Then she stepped forward and knelt beside the German shepherd. Bella rested her head lightly against Margaret's shoulder, calm and trusting. Margaret closed her eyes, smiling through the emotion that warmed her face more than the winter sun ever could. Ethan watched from a respectful distance, understanding that some moments belonged only to the hearts being healed within them. The old kennel no longer felt like a monument to loss. It had quietly become a bridge between cherished memories and new beginnings, reminding all of them that love did not grow smaller when shared again. It simply found another place to call home. Spring arrived quietly, almost as if the valley itself had decided not to disturb the peace it had finally rediscovered. The last patches of snow disappeared beneath warm afternoon sunlight, revealing green grass that had waited patiently beneath the frozen ground all winter. Wildflowers returned along the fence line in small clusters of yellow and white, and the old maple tree beside the woodshed stretched fresh leaves toward a bright blue sky. The farmhouse no longer stood in silence. Every morning began with the cheerful sounds of 3 growing German shepherd puppies racing across the yard, tumbling over one another with clumsy enthusiasm, while Bella watched nearby with calm confidence. She no longer carried the anxious look Ethan had first seen beneath the collapsing toolshed. Her amber eyes had softened. She knew her family was safe. Ethan visited often, even after returning to his own home several hours away. Whenever his truck rolled into the driveway, the puppies charged toward him as though greeting an old friend they had known all their lives. Bella always followed at a slower pace, dignified as ever, waiting until Ethan knelt before gently resting her head beneath his hand. It became their quiet tradition, one that never required words. Margaret would usually be standing on the porch with 2 mugs of fresh coffee waiting, smiling before either of them reached the steps. The loneliness that had once settled over the farmhouse like an endless winter had slowly given way to ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because they were shared. Together they repaired the old kennel completely. The weathered roof was replaced. Fresh cedar boards covered the worn walls. The faded blue blanket remained inside, carefully washed and folded exactly where it had always rested. Margaret hung the old photograph of Daniel and Duke in a place where morning sunlight reached it every day. This time she did not place it there to remember loss. She placed it there to celebrate love that had never truly disappeared. One warm Saturday afternoon, Ethan finished carving a new wooden sign for the entrance to the property. Margaret watched quietly as he secured it beside the front gate. The words were simple. Every soul finds warmth here. She stood beside him for several moments without speaking. Then she reached for his hand with gentle gratitude. I spent years believing I was protecting my heart, she said softly. I never realized I was locking it away. Ethan looked across the yard where Bella rested beneath the maple tree while her puppies explored the grass, chasing butterflies instead of snowflakes. Sometimes healing does not arrive with answers, he replied. Sometimes it arrives asking for shelter. Margaret nodded, her eyes shining in the afternoon light. She understood now. The greatest gift that winter night had not been the blankets, the fire, or even the roof above their heads. It had been the chance to choose compassion one more time. As summer slowly approached, neighbors began stopping by the farmhouse again. Children laughed while playing with the growing puppies. Travelers occasionally paused after seeing the sign beside the road, always greeted with a smile, a glass of cold lemonade, and often a wagging tail or 4. The old property became known as a place where kindness was never in short supply. Bella remained exactly as she had always been, quietly watching over everyone who entered, greeting each visitor with calm wisdom that seemed far older than words could explain. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, Ethan sat on the porch beside Margaret. Bella rested peacefully at their feet, while the 3 young dogs chased one another across the glowing field. Neither Ethan nor Margaret felt any need to fill the silence. The wind carried the scent of fresh hay and blooming wildflowers through the valley, and somewhere nearby a meadowlark sang its final song before nightfall. Ethan looked toward the family of dogs and smiled. Funny how one small decision can change everything, he said. Margaret followed his gaze. Not one decision, she answered gently. Many small ones. A hand that knocked on a door. A mother who refused to leave her puppies. A stranger willing to stay in the cold. A heart willing to open again. The evening settled peacefully around them as the first stars appeared overhead. The farmhouse glowed warmly against the fading light, no longer standing as a lonely place marked by old sorrow, but as a home where compassion had quietly become a way of life. and long after the harsh winter had passed, the warmth shared on one unforgettable night continued to spread, proving that even the smallest act of mercy could become the beginning of someone else's hope.